The lawyer's voice droned on in the stuffy parlor, reading words that would seal Margaret Monroe's fate before she even understood what was happening. And when he finally looked up from the will with sympathetic eyes, she knew her life had just shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 3 weeks. The consumption had taken him slowly, painfully, and Margaret had nursed him through every agonizing moment of it. She had held his hand, whispered prayers, and promised to honor his memory. Now, in late September of 1881, she sat in the home they had shared for 2 years in Deer Lodge, Montana, surrounded by his family, learning that Thomas had left everything to his older brother Franklin. Everything. The house, the small ranch, the cattle, even the furniture Margaret had brought from her own family when she married. Thomas had written the will before their marriage, the lawyer explained with obvious discomfort, and had never updated it. An oversight, surely, but legally binding nonetheless. Franklin Monroe sat across from Margaret with his wife Constance, his expression carefully neutral. He was a harder man than Thomas had been, weathered by years of working the land and losing his own first wife to childbirth. When the lawyer finished and gathered his papers, Franklin finally spoke. "You understand this is awkward for all of us," he said, his voice flat and unyielding. "But the law is the law." Margaret felt her hands trembling in her lap. She wore her black morning dress, the one she had sewn herself from fabric Thomas had bought her last Christmas. "Surely we can come to some arrangement. This was my home." Thomas should have thought of that before he died," Constance interrupted, her pinched face showing no sympathy. "We have our own children to think about. We cannot afford to support another mouth." "I'm not asking for support," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can work. I have been managing the household, helping with the ranch accounts. I only need a place to stay until I can make other arrangements." Franklin shook his head slowly. "The ranch is mine now. I will be making changes. There is no place for you here." The words struck her like a physical blow. Margaret looked around the room, at the curtains she had hung, the rug she had beaten clean just last week, the portrait of Thomas on the mantel. "When would you like me to leave?" "Today," Franklin said without hesitation. "We will be moving our family in tomorrow morning. You may take your personal clothing and any items you can prove came from your family. Nothing else." Margaret's throat tightened. "Today? But where am I to go?" Constance stood, smoothing her skirts. "You must have family somewhere. Write to them. But you cannot stay here. Franklin, show her out when she has packed her things." The two of them left the parlor, and Margaret heard them climbing the stairs to inspect their new property. The lawyer lingered, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Monroe, I am truly sorry. If there is anything I can do to help you contest this—" "Can it be contested?" Margaret asked, grasping at hope. He grimaced. "Not successfully, I'm afraid. The will is clear, and without your name on any of the property deeds, you have no legal claim. I wish the law were different, but it is not." After he left, Margaret sat alone in the parlor for a long moment, trying to absorb the enormity of what had just happened. She had no family left. Her parents had died of influenza 5 years ago, and her only sister had moved to California with her husband, a journey Margaret could not possibly afford. She had $12 to her name, the clothes on her back, and nowhere to go. Moving mechanically, she climbed the stairs to the bedroom she had shared with Thomas. Someone had already stripped the bed. Her trunk sat open, her clothes dumped unceremoniously inside. She folded them carefully, her hands moving of their own accord while her mind raced. She found her mother's cameo brooch, her grandmother's Bible, a few letters. Such small things to represent a life. Franklin appeared in the doorway. "The wagon is waiting." "I have not finished. You have had enough time. Take what is packed and go." Margaret wanted to argue, to scream, to demand justice, but she saw in Franklin's face that there would be none. He had what he wanted, and she was simply an inconvenience to be removed. She closed the trunk, and Franklin carried it downstairs without another word. He loaded it onto a wagon driven by a ranch hand she barely knew, then stepped back. "Where should I tell him to take you?" Franklin asked. Margaret realized with a sinking feeling that she truly had no answer. "Into town," she said finally. "The boarding house, I suppose." Franklin nodded and relayed the instructions. The driver clicked to the horses and the wagon lurched forward. Margaret did not look back at the house. She could not bear to. Deer Lodge was not a large town, but it was growing. Silver mines in the nearby mountains had brought an influx of prospectors and businessmen, and the town now boasted 2 hotels, several saloons, a general store, a church, and various other establishments. The boarding house sat on the east end of the main street, a 2-story building with faded yellow paint and a sign that promised clean rooms and respectable lodging. Mrs. Patterson, the proprietor, was a heavy-set woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She listened to Margaret's halting explanation, then shook her head. "I am sorry, dear, but I require payment in advance. $2 a week for a room, and that does not include meals." Margaret did quick arithmetic in her head. Her $12 would last 6 weeks if she ate nothing. "Is there perhaps work I could do in exchange for lodging? I can cook, clean, do laundry." "I already have help for those things," Mrs. Patterson said, though her tone was sympathetic. "Have you tried the hotel? They sometimes need chambermaids." The hotel manager was less kind. He looked at Margaret's morning dress and red-rimmed eyes and shook his head before she even finished speaking. "No positions available. Try the saloons if you are desperate." Margaret left quickly, her cheeks burning. She walked the length of the main street, inquiring at the general store, the bakery, even the blacksmith. No one needed help. No one had work for a widow with no references and no skills beyond household management. By late afternoon, Margaret found herself sitting on a bench outside the church, her trunk beside her, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. The September sun was warm, but there was a chill in the air that promised winter was not far off. She could not sleep outside. She had no tent, no bedroll, nothing. "Madam, are you all right?" Margaret looked up to find a man standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands. He was tall and rangy, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. Dust covered his clothes, and he wore a gun belt slung low on his hips. A cowboy, clearly, though his face held a gentleness that surprised her. "I'm fine, thank you," Margaret said automatically, though her voice shook. He did not leave. Instead, he gestured to the trunk. "Looks like you might be in a difficult spot. Is there someone I can fetch for you? Family, maybe?" "I have no family here," Margaret admitted, too tired to maintain the pretense. "My husband passed recently, and his brother has inherited everything. I'm simply determining where I will go next." The cowboy's expression shifted to something like anger, though not directed at her. "He threw you out?" "The law gave him the right," Margaret said, defensive despite herself. "The property was his. That does not make it right." He was quiet for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "My name is Russell Kane. I run a small horse ranch about 5 miles north of town. It is not much, but I have a spare room in the main house. You are welcome to stay there as long as you need." Margaret stared at him. "I could not possibly. We are strangers. It would not be proper." "Proper does not keep you from freezing when winter comes," Russell said bluntly. "Look, I'm not asking for anything in return. I have a housekeeper who comes in 3 times a week, an older woman named Mrs. Garrett. She can chaperone if you are worried about reputation. I just hate seeing someone in need when I have the means to help." "But why would you do this for a stranger?" Russell looked away, his jaw tightening. "My sister found herself in a similar position once. No one helped her. She died the following winter. I swore I would never stand by and watch someone suffer when I could do something about it." The simple honesty in his words broke through Margaret's resistance. She was out of options and out of time. "I cannot pay you. I did not ask you to." He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "My horse is tied up at the saloon. I will get the wagon from the livery. Wait here." He returned within 15 minutes, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 bay horses. He loaded her trunk into the back, then helped her onto the seat with a courtesy that spoke of good breeding, despite his rough appearance. As they drove out of town, Margaret felt the eyes of the townspeople on them, and she knew the gossip would start immediately. The widow Monroe leaving town with a strange cowboy. Her reputation, already fragile, would be in tatters by morning. But what choice did she have? The land north of Deer Lodge was beautiful, rolling hills covered in gold-brown grass and dotted with pine trees. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Russell's ranch appeared after about 40 minutes of travel, a collection of buildings including a modest two-story house, a large barn, several corrals, and a bunkhouse. Horses grazed in the nearest pasture, their coats gleaming in the late afternoon sun. "It is not fancy," Russell said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but it is home." A grizzled older man emerged from the barn, his eyebrows rising when he saw Margaret. "Boss, who is this?" "Margaret Monroe. This is Henry Ford, my foreman," Russell said. "Henry, Mrs. Monroe will be staying in the spare room for a while. See that the men know she's to be treated with respect." Henry's weathered face softened with understanding. "Yes, sir. Madam, welcome to the Kane ranch." Russell carried her trunk inside, and Margaret followed, her heart pounding with uncertainty. The house was clean but sparsely furnished, with the practical air of a place where a single man lived. The kitchen was large and well-equipped. The sitting room held a few comfortable chairs and a stone fireplace, and the walls were bare of decoration. "Your room is upstairs," Russell said, leading the way. "It has a bed, a dresser, and a washstand. I will have Henry bring up water for washing. The privy is out back, and there is a pump in the kitchen for drinking water." He set her trunk down, in a small but pleasant room with a window overlooking the corrals. The bed was made with clean linens, and someone had placed a vase of dried wildflowers on the dresser. "Mrs. Garrett must have prepared this," Russell said, looking surprised. "She has a way of knowing when something is needed before I even tell her." Margaret turned to face him, overwhelmed by his kindness. "Mr. Kane, I do not know how to thank you. This is extraordinarily generous." "No thanks needed." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly not accustomed to gratitude. "I will let you rest. Come down to the kitchen when you are ready, and I will see about supper." After he left, Margaret sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Great, shuddering sobs that she had been holding back all day. She cried for Thomas, for the life she had lost, for the cruelty of his brother, and the injustice of laws that left widows with nothing. But underneath the grief was a strange, fragile sense of relief. She was safe, at least for tonight. She had a roof over her head and a locked door. It was more than she had expected to have by sunset. When her tears finally subsided, Margaret washed her face in the basin of water someone had quietly left outside her door. She unpinned her hair, brushed it out, and repinned it in a simple bun. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a pale, exhausted woman with red eyes, but she lifted her chin. She would survive this. She had no other choice. Downstairs, she found Russell in the kitchen, frying bacon and eggs with the ease of someone long accustomed to caring for himself. "I am not much of a cook," he admitted when he saw her, "but I can manage the basics. Mrs. Garrett usually leaves me stew or bread, but she was not here today." "Please let me help," Margaret said, moving toward the stove. "It is the least I can do." They worked together in companionable silence, and Margaret found herself relaxing slightly. Russell was not talkative, but his presence was calming. He moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin, and he treated her with a careful respect that made her feel human again after the humiliation of the afternoon. They ate at the kitchen table, and Russell told her a bit about the ranch. He raised horses mostly, selling them to the army and to ranchers who needed good working stock. He had 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, plus Henry, who had his own small cabin near the barn. It was a modest operation, but profitable enough to keep everyone employed and fed. "What will you do?" Russell asked as they finished eating. "Do you have plans?" Margaret shook her head. "I need to find work, but there seems to be none in Deer Lodge. Perhaps I could travel to Helena or Butte, though I do not have funds for passage." "You could stay here and help Mrs. Garrett," Russell suggested. "She has been complaining that the house is too much for her to manage alone. I could pay you a fair wage, enough to save up if you want to leave eventually." "You have already done so much," Margaret protested. "And I am offering honest work, not charity," Russell said firmly. "I need the help and you need the employment. It benefits us both." Margaret considered this. It would give her time to figure out her next steps, and it would allow her to maintain her dignity by earning her keep. What would the work entail? Cooking, cleaning, laundry, maybe helping with the kitchen garden. Mrs. Garrett can teach you what you need to know. She comes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. You would handle the other days and perhaps help her on the days she is here. It was more than fair. It was generous to the point of being almost unbelievable. Margaret searched Russell's face for any hint of ulterior motive, but found only honest pragmatism. "Then I accept, with gratitude." Good. Russell stood and began clearing the dishes. You should rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough to start working out the details. Margaret helped him wash up, then retreated to her room. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and despite her emotional exhaustion, she found herself lying awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Horses nickered in the corrals, someone played a harmonica in the bunkhouse, and the wind whispered through the pines. It was so different from the house she had shared with Thomas, so different from everything she had known. But perhaps different was what she needed now. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn, a habit from years of farm life. She dressed in one of her simpler dresses, grateful that she'd been allowed to keep at least her clothes, and made her way downstairs. Russell was already in the kitchen, building up the fire in the stove. "You did not have to get up so early," he said, looking surprised to see her. "I'm accustomed to it," Margaret replied. "Please teach me where things are kept and I will make breakfast." She discovered that Russell kept a well-stocked pantry thanks to Mrs. Garrett's organizational skills. There was flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and various preserves. She made biscuits, fried eggs, and strong coffee, and when Henry and the other ranch hands came in for breakfast, they greeted her with shy politeness and obvious curiosity. "Madam," said a young man introduced as James, "these are the best biscuits I have had in years." "Mrs. Garrett is a fine cook," Henry added diplomatically, "but she has a heavy hand with the salt." The men ate with the focused intensity of people who worked hard physical labor, and Margaret found satisfaction in feeding them. It was purposeful work, necessary work, and it made her feel less like a charity case. After breakfast, Russell showed her around the ranch while the men went about their tasks. He introduced her to his horses, explaining their lineages and temperaments with obvious pride. Margaret had grown up around farm animals, but these horses were different, carefully bred for intelligence and endurance. Russell's favorite was a tall black gelding named Midnight, who nuzzled his pockets looking for treats. "He is beautiful," Margaret said, reaching out to stroke the horse's neck. "His mother was a Mustang I gentled myself," Russell said. "His father was a thoroughbred I bought from a ranch in Wyoming. The combination makes for a strong, smart horse with good instincts." As they walked, Margaret learned more about Russell's life. He had grown up in Texas, the son of a ranch foreman, and had learned the horse trade from his father. He had come to Montana 6 years ago with a dream of starting his own operation, and had slowly built the ranch from nothing. He was 32 years old, had never been married, and seemed content with his solitary life. "What about you?" Russell asked as they leaned against a corral fence watching the horses. "How did you end up in Deer Lodge?" Margaret told him about meeting Thomas at a church social in her hometown of Bozeman, about their courtship and marriage, about the 2 years they had spent building a life together. She found herself talking about things she had not spoken of to anyone, about her dreams of children and a lasting home, about the slow horror of watching Thomas waste away from consumption. "He was a good man," she said softly. "He would have been mortified by what his brother did. Franklin was not always so hard. I think losing his wife changed him." "That is no excuse for cruelty," Russell said, his voice hard. "A man's character shows in how he treats those who are powerless to fight back." Margaret glanced at him, struck by the intensity of his words. "You truly believe that?" "I have seen too much of the other kind of man," Russell said, "the kind who takes what he wants and justifies it however he can. I try to be different." There was a story there, Margaret sensed, but she did not press. They had known each other less than a day. There would be time for deeper conversations if she stayed. Mrs. Garrett arrived that afternoon, a plump woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked Margaret up and down, then nodded approvingly. "So you are the one Russell brought home. About time he showed some sense. This house needs a woman's touch." "Mrs. Garrett, I have offered Mrs. Monroe employment helping you with the household work," Russell explained. "I thought you could show her your routines." "Good," Mrs. Garrett said briskly. "My knees are not what they used to be, and scrubbing floors is getting harder every year. Come along, dear. Let us go over the kitchen first." Margaret spent the afternoon learning Mrs. Garrett's systems. The older woman was efficient and knowledgeable, with strong opinions about how things should be done, but she was also kind, and Margaret could tell that her gruffness hid a warm heart. "Russell's a good man," Mrs. Garrett said as they folded laundry together. "Too good sometimes. He takes on everyone's problems as if they were his own. I'm glad he found someone who needs help rather than someone looking to take advantage." "I have no intention of taking advantage," Margaret said quietly. "I can see that. You have an honest face." Mrs. Garrett pinned her with a shrewd look. "But you should know that people will talk. A young widow living on a bachelor's ranch, even with me coming by regular, there will be gossip." "I know," Margaret admitted, "but I had nowhere else to go." "Then hold your head high and let them talk," Mrs. Garrett said firmly. "Anyone with sense will see you are a respectable woman doing honest work. The rest do not matter." The days fell into a rhythm. Margaret rose early, made breakfast for the household, cleaned, did laundry, tended the kitchen garden, and prepared supper. On the days Mrs. Garrett came, they worked together, and Margaret learned skills she had never needed before, from rendering lard to making soap to preserving vegetables for winter. On the other days, she managed alone, finding satisfaction in the work and in the quiet companionship of the ranch. Russell was an easy person to live near. He was not demanding, and he treated her with unfailing courtesy. In the evenings, they often sat in the kitchen after supper, drinking coffee and talking about everything from politics to literature to the best way to train a stubborn horse. Margaret discovered that Russell was far more educated than his rough exterior suggested. He had taught himself to read as a child and had a hungry mind that consumed any book he could find. "My father thought reading was a waste of time for a ranch hand," Russell said one evening as they discussed a newspaper article about railroad expansion. "But my mother taught me anyway. She said a man who could not read was a man who could not think for himself." "She sounds like a wise woman," Margaret said. "She was. She died when I was 14. Fever took her in 3 days. Russell stared into his coffee cup. "My father was never the same after that. He worked himself into an early grave." "I am sorry," Margaret said softly. "It seems we have both lost people we loved." "Too many people," Russell agreed, "but life keeps moving whether we are ready or not." As September turned to October, Margaret felt herself slowly coming back to life. The sharp edge of grief was still there, but it no longer threatened to drown her. She found herself noticing small beauties again, the way morning light gilded the mountains, the satisfaction of bread rising perfectly, the soft nicker of horses greeting her when she walked past the corrals. She also found herself noticing Russell in ways that made her feel guilty. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, rare as those smiles were. The strength in his hands as he worked with the horses. The sound of his voice in the darkness when they sat on the porch after supper talking about nothing and everything. It was too soon, she told herself. Thomas had been dead barely 2 months. She was still in mourning. These feelings were simply gratitude confused with something else, a natural response to kindness after cruelty. But her heart did not listen to logic. One afternoon in mid-October, Margaret was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching fast. She turned to see 3 riders coming up the road, and her heart sank when she recognized Franklin Monroe's heavy build on the lead horse. Russell emerged from the barn, his expression turning hard when he saw who was arriving. He moved to stand between Margaret and the riders, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Franklin reined in his horse, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with obvious disdain. "So this is where you ran off to? Living with a cowboy now, are you, Margaret? Thomas would be ashamed." "Do not speak my husband's name," Margaret said, her voice shaking with anger. "You have no right after what you did." "I did what the law allowed," Franklin said coldly, "and now I am here to retrieve the items you stole from my property." "I stole nothing," Margaret protested. "I took only what was mine." "That cameo brooch belonged to Thomas's mother. It should have come to me." Franklin's eyes were hard and greedy. "I want it back, along with anything else of value you took." Russell stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "I think you should leave now." Franklin finally seemed to register Russell's presence. "This is family business. It does not concern you. Mrs. Monroe is a guest on my property, which makes it very much my concern," Russell said. "You have made your claim. She has denied it. Unless you have legal documents proving ownership of specific items, I suggest you ride back to Deer Lodge." "Legal documents?" Franklin laughed harshly. "You think the law cares what some cowboy thinks? I could have the sheriff out here in an hour." "Then do it," Russell said calmly. "Bring the sheriff, bring a judge if you want. Let them determine ownership, but until then, you are trespassing on my land, and I'm asking you to leave." The two other men with Franklin shifted uncomfortably. They were ranch hands, Margaret realized, not gunfighters. They had no interest in escalating this into violence. Franklin must have sensed the same thing because he backed his horse up a step. This is not over. That brooch was worth $50 at least. I will have what is mine. The brooch was my mother's, Margaret said, finding her voice. She gave it to me on her deathbed. Thomas knew that. If you truly cared about his mother's memory, you would leave me in peace. His mother is dead, and so is he, Franklin said brutally. All that matters now is the property, and it belongs to me. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it back toward the road, his men following. Margaret watched them go, her hands clenched in the wet laundry she had been hanging. Are you all right? Russell asked, his hand gentle on her shoulder. He will cause trouble, Margaret said, her voice unsteady. He could have me arrested for theft, my word against his, and he is an established property owner, while I am just a widow with no standing. Do you have proof the brooch was your mother's? Margaret thought frantically. I have letters from my sister. She mentions the brooch, how beautiful it looked on me at my wedding. Would that be enough? It might be. Where are the letters? In my trunk upstairs. They went inside, and Margaret retrieved the letters, her hands shaking as she sorted through them. She found the one from her sister Catherine, dated just after her wedding. Here. She writes about the brooch, about how fitting it was that I wore something of mother's on such an important day. Russell read the letter carefully. This should be sufficient, but we need to be prepared for Franklin to push this. He seems like a man who does not let go easily. I am sorry, Margaret said miserably. I have brought you nothing but trouble. You have brought good cooking and pleasant company, Russell said firmly. As for trouble, I can handle it. I have dealt with worse than Franklin Monroe. But Margaret could see the concern in his eyes, and she felt guilt gnaw at her. Russell had opened his home to her without question, and now she was repaying him by bringing her problems to his doorstep. That evening, Russell rode into town and returned with a lawyer, a young man named David Pierce, who had recently opened a practice in Deer Lodge. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Margaret explained the entire situation while Russell listened silently. The will is unfortunately clear, Pierce said after hearing everything. The property went to Franklin Monroe. However, your personal possessions are exactly that personal. If you have documentation proving the brooch belonged to your mother, Franklin has no legal claim to it. What if he persists? Russell asked. Then we go before a judge and settle it officially, Pierce said. But I doubt it will come to that. Franklin Monroe may be greedy, but he is not stupid. He knows that pushing too hard will make him look bad in the community, and he needs the goodwill of his neighbors to run that ranch successfully. Pierce left detailed instructions about what to do if Franklin returned or contacted the sheriff. Margaret felt slightly better, knowing there was a legal path forward, but the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. That night, she lay awake in her room, listening to the house settle around her. She heard Russell moving around downstairs, his boots on the wooden floor, the creak of the door as he stepped outside for his nightly check of the property. She had grown accustomed to these sounds over the past weeks, found comfort in them. The thought of having to leave, of losing this fragile safety she had found, terrified her. The next few days were tense. Margaret jumped at every sound, expecting Franklin to return with the sheriff. But nothing happened. The ranch work continued as normal, and gradually Margaret began to relax again. Mrs. Garrett, when she heard about Franklin's visit, was outraged. That man has a lot of nerve. Everyone knows he treated his first wife poorly, worked her to death practically, and now he is trying to squeeze money out of you. Shameful. Do people in town talk about me? Margaret asked hesitantly. About my staying here? Mrs. Garrett's expression softened. Some do, but most folks have sense enough to see you are working for your keep, and Russell is behaving like a gentleman. Anyone who matters knows you are respectable. And the ones who do not think I am respectable are not worth your concern, Mrs. Garrett said firmly. Now, let me show you how to make a proper sourdough starter. Winter is coming, and we will want good bread when the snow gets deep. October slipped into November, and the first real snow fell, dusting the mountains and making the mornings crisp and cold. Margaret helped Russell and the men prepare the ranch for winter, preserving the last of the garden vegetables, stacking firewood, checking the barn for drafts. It was hard work, but satisfying, and Margaret felt herself growing stronger, both physically and emotionally. Russell was teaching her to ride using a gentle mare named Daisy. At first, Margaret was terrified of falling, but Russell was patient, walking beside her and offering quiet encouragement. Gradually, she gained confidence, and by mid-November she could ride well enough to accompany Russell on short trips around the ranch. One afternoon, they rode out to check on a fence line in the far pasture. The sky was gray with the promise of snow, and the air had that peculiar stillness that comes before a storm. They worked side by side, repairing a section where the wire had come loose, and Margaret marveled at how comfortable this felt. How natural. "You have gotten good at this," Russell said as she handed him the tools he needed. "Not many people adapt to ranch life so quickly." "I grew up on a farm," Margaret reminded him. "This is not so different." "It is more than that." Russell secured the last wire, then turned to face her. "You have a natural way with animals, and you work harder than most men I have known. You belong out here." The compliment made Margaret flush with pleasure. "I enjoy it. I did not expect to, given the circumstances of how I came here, but I find peace in this work." "Peace is valuable," Russell said softly, "especially after suffering." They stood there for a moment, the wind whipping Margaret's skirts around her legs, and she felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, an understanding that went beyond words. Russell's eyes held hers, and she saw in them a depth of feeling that made her breath catch. Then snowflakes began to fall, fat and heavy, and Russell stepped back. "We should get back before this gets worse." They rode home through thickening snow, and Margaret could not stop thinking about that moment by the fence, about the way Russell had looked at her, about the way her heart had responded. That evening, after supper, they sat by the fire in the sitting room. It was the first time they had used this room since Margaret had arrived, Russell explaining that he usually just stayed in the kitchen to save on firewood, but the temperature had dropped dramatically and they needed the extra heat. Margaret worked on mending a shirt while Russell read a book of poetry he had borrowed from the town library. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of wind outside. It was intensely domestic, intensely intimate, and Margaret felt her carefully maintained emotional distance beginning to crumble. "Russell," she said suddenly, then stopped, not sure what she wanted to say. He looked up from his book. "Yes? Why did you really bring me here?" The question had been burning in her for weeks. "The truth, not the story about your sister." Russell closed the book carefully. "That was not a story. My sister Emma did die after being turned out by her husband's family. She was 19 years old. I am sorry. I did not mean to imply, but you are right that it is not the only reason," Russell interrupted. "The truth is, when I saw you sitting on that bench looking so lost, you reminded me of someone." "Who?" "Myself, 6 years ago when I first came to Montana. I had nothing but my saddle and my horse, and I did not know if I would survive the winter. An old rancher named Tom Keller gave me a job, taught me what I needed to know, helped me save enough to buy this land. He did not have to. I was a stranger, and I had nothing to offer him. But he helped me anyway, and I swore that if I ever had the chance, I would do the same for someone else." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "That's a beautiful reason." "There's more," Russell said quietly. "The first time I saw you, even before I knew your story, I felt something. A connection, maybe, or recognition. I do not know how to explain it, but I knew I could not walk away and leave you there." "I felt it too," Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel it still." Russell set his book aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Margaret, I need to be honest with you. My feelings have grown beyond simple compassion. You have become important to me in ways I did not expect. But I know you are still grieving. I know it has only been a few months since you lost your husband. I do not want to add to your burdens by pushing for something you are not ready for." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I care for you, deeply. And if the time ever comes when you are ready to open your heart again, I would be honored to be the one you choose." He paused, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "But I will not rush you. I will wait as long as you need." Margaret set down her mending with trembling hands. She knew she should be cautious. Grief and gratitude could be confused with love. It was too soon. People would talk. There were 100 reasons to be sensible, but her heart had already made its choice. "I think," she said carefully, "that the heart does not follow a schedule. I will always love Thomas and honor his memory. But he is gone, and I am still here. And what I feel when I look at you is not gratitude or desperation. It is something else. Something real." Russell's face transformed, hope lighting his features. "Are you certain?" "Not entirely," Margaret admitted. "This is all so new, and I'm still finding my way. But I know that you make me feel safe. You make me feel valued. And when I imagine my future now, you are in it." Russell stood and crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it so they were at eye level. "Then let us take this slowly. Let us see where it leads. And if you ever feel I am moving too fast or asking too much, you will tell me." "I will," Margaret promised. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her eyes sting with tears. They stayed like that for a long moment, the fire warming them, the storm raging outside, and Margaret felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. The winter months that followed were both challenging and beautiful. Snow piled high around the ranch buildings, and there were days when the cold was so intense that everyone stayed inside unless absolutely necessary. But inside the ranch house, there was warmth and light and a growing sense of belonging. Russell courted Margaret with quiet devotion. He brought her small gifts, a ribbon from town, a book of poetry, wildflowers he had somehow found preserved beneath the snow. He helped her with the heavy work without making her feel incapable. He listened when she needed to talk about Thomas, never jealous or impatient, understanding that grief and new love could coexist. Margaret found herself falling deeper each day. She loved the way Russell was gentle with the horses, firm but never cruel. She loved his quiet humor and his fierce sense of justice. She loved the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his expression full of wonder, as if he could not quite believe she was real. Mrs. Garrett watched their growing attachment with obvious approval. "About time that man had someone," she said one afternoon in late December. "He's been alone too long, throwing himself into work and pretending it was enough." "Do you think people will understand?" Margaret asked. "It has only been a few months since Thomas died." "People who matter will understand that love comes when it comes, not according to some arbitrary schedule," Mrs. Garrett said. "And people who do not understand do not matter. It is that simple." On Christmas Eve, Russell gave Margaret a gift wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a beautiful shawl, deep blue wool with delicate embroidery at the edges. "I sent away to Helena for it," he explained, looking suddenly shy. "I thought the color would match your eyes." Margaret clutched the shawl to her chest, overwhelmed. "It is beautiful. I have nothing to give you." "You have given me everything," Russell said simply. "You have made this house a home." That evening, they attended Christmas services at the church in town. Margaret was nervous about facing the townspeople, but Russell held her arm with quiet confidence, and she drew strength from his presence. She saw Franklin Monroe in the back pew with Constance, but he did not approach her. In fact, he looked away when their eyes met, and Margaret felt a small flare of satisfaction. After the service, several townspeople greeted her warmly, and Margaret realized that Mrs. Garrett had been right. Most people saw her situation for what it was, a woman making an honest living after suffering a terrible loss. Only a few gave her cold looks, and even those were directed more at Russell than at her, resentment perhaps that a bachelor cowboy had found such a capable partner. January brought brutal cold and snowstorms that lasted for days. The ranch hands stayed in the bunkhouse, emerging only to care for the animals, and Russell brought them food from the main house, not trusting them to cook adequately for themselves in such conditions. During one particularly fierce storm, Margaret and Russell were snowed in together with only Mrs. Garrett, who had arrived the day before and could not risk the journey home. The older woman took over the spare room, leaving Margaret and Russell to their respective spaces, but she smiled knowingly when she saw how they gravitated toward each other. "I am going to check on Mrs. Garrett," she announced one evening after supper. "I imagine I will go to bed early. These old bones need extra rest in this cold." After she left, Russell and Margaret sat together on the settee by the fire, closer than propriety strictly allowed. Margaret leaned her head on Russell's shoulder, feeling his warmth seep into her, and sighed with contentment. "Happy?" Russell asked softly. Very, Margaret admitted. I know I should not be, so soon after everything that happened, but I am. You are allowed to be happy, Russell said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Life is too short and too hard to waste time feeling guilty for finding joy. Margaret tilted her face up to look at him, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. When he kissed her, it was gentle and sweet, full of promise and patience. Margaret kissed him back, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady. They pulled apart slowly, and Russell rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Margaret Monroe. I have loved you since the day you agreed to stay, maybe even before that. I know it is soon, and I know you need time, but I needed to say it. You do not have to say it back. I just needed you to know. But Margaret did not hesitate. I love you too, Russell Kane. I did not think I could feel this way again, but you have shown me that the heart is more resilient than I believed. They held each other close while the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, and Margaret felt at peace in a way she had not since Thomas's death, perhaps even before then, if she was honest with herself. What she and Thomas had shared was real and precious, but it had been a young love, untested by real hardship. What she felt for Russell was deeper, forged in pain and survival and mutual respect. By February, the worst of winter had passed, and the ranch began preparing for spring. Russell and Margaret talked seriously about the future now, making plans together as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I want to marry you, Russell said one evening, properly, with a ceremony and everything legal. But I will wait as long as you need. A year, 2 years, whatever feels right to you. Margaret considered this. She was still wearing her mourning clothes, still technically in the period where society expected her to remain withdrawn. But she had learned over the past months that society's expectations had little to do with the reality of survival, and even less to do with genuine feeling. I want to wait until summer, she said finally. Not because I am uncertain, but because I want to marry you in sunshine, not snow. I want wildflowers and warm weather and celebration, not secrecy or shame. Summer it is, Russell agreed, his smile brilliant. They told Mrs. Garrett the next day, and she immediately began planning. June, she declared. June is the perfect time for a wedding. The weather will be fine, and we can have a party right here at the ranch. Word spread through town quickly, as it always did, and reactions were mixed. Some people congratulated Margaret warmly, happy to see her finding joy after tragedy. Others whispered that she was disrespecting her husband's memory, that 6 months was hardly sufficient mourning time. Franklin Monroe sent a letter through his lawyer, threatening to contest any marriage on the grounds that Margaret was an adulteress who had obviously been involved with Russell while Thomas was still alive. David Pierce, Margaret's lawyer, responded with a coldly factual letter outlining exactly how baseless such claims were and threatening legal action for defamation if Franklin persisted. Franklin backed down, but not before spreading enough rumors that Margaret's reputation in Deer Lodge was thoroughly compromised. Margaret found that she did not care as much as she expected to. Let people think what they wanted. She knew the truth, and so did the people who mattered. As spring arrived and the snow melted, the ranch burst into activity. There were foals to be born, fences to repair, fields to plant. Margaret worked alongside Russell and the ranch hands, and she felt herself blooming along with the wildflowers that dotted the hills. In April, a letter arrived from Margaret's sister Catherine in California. She had finally received the letter Margaret had sent months ago, explaining everything that had happened. Catherine wrote with sympathy and love and included money for passage if Margaret wanted to come to California. I have a life here, Margaret told Russell when she showed him the letter. A life I built with you. California is Catherine's home, not mine. Are you certain? You might have more opportunities there, a fresh start where no one knows your history. My history is part of me, Margaret said firmly. I will not run from it. Besides, I wrote to her about you. She wants to meet the man who took me in and treated me with such kindness. Russell flushed at the praise. I only did what was right. You did more than that. You gave me hope when I had none. They were married on a Saturday afternoon in mid-June in the small church in Deer Lodge. Margaret wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Garrett had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Russell had picked that morning. Henry served as Russell's best man, and Mrs. Garrett stood up with Margaret. The church was only half full, some people staying away out of disapproval or loyalty to Franklin Monroe, but those who came did so with genuine warmth, and the ceremony was beautiful. When Russell slipped the gold band onto Margaret's finger, his hand was steady and sure, and when he kissed her as man and wife, Margaret felt her old life fall away completely. The reception at the ranch was joyful and boisterous, with food and music and dancing that lasted until well after sunset. Margaret danced with Russell under the stars, his arms strong around her, and she marveled at how far she had come from that desperate woman sitting on a bench outside the church 9 months ago. "Happy?" Russell asked, echoing his question from that snowy night months before. "Blissfully," Margaret answered. "I never thought I could be this happy again." "This is only the beginning," Russell promised. "We have our whole lives ahead of us." The summer was glorious, full of hard work and deep contentment. Margaret continued managing the household, but now as Russell's wife and partner rather than his employee. They worked together in all things, making decisions jointly, building not just a ranch but a true home. In late September, almost exactly 1 year after Franklin had thrown her out, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told Russell one evening after supper, watching nervously for his reaction. His face lit up with wonder. "A baby? Truly?" "Truly," Margaret confirmed. "If my calculations are correct, sometime in early April." Russell swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "We're going to be parents. Margaret, I cannot believe it. This is the most wonderful news." The pregnancy was healthy, and Margaret continued her work around the ranch with only minor adjustments as she grew larger. Russell hovered protectively, trying to prevent her from lifting anything heavy or working too hard, until Margaret finally had to remind him that women had been having babies while doing farm work since the beginning of time. Winter came again, and this time Margaret faced it with confidence rather than fear. The ranch was prepared, the pantry was full, and she was surrounded by people she loved. Mrs. Garrett fussed over her constantly, bringing special foods and ensuring she rested enough. Henry and the ranch hands treated her like fragile porcelain, leaping to help with any task she attempted. "I am pregnant, not dying," Margaret protested after Henry insisted on carrying a basket of laundry that she could have managed easily. "Humor us," Henry said with a rare smile. "We are all excited about this baby. Let us help." In early April, on a day when the snow was finally melting and the first green shoots were appearing in the garden, Margaret went into labor. Russell sent Henry racing for the doctor while Mrs. Garrett took charge of the house. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night, and there were moments when Margaret wondered if she had the strength to continue. But Russell never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement. "You can do this. You are the strongest person I know. Just a little longer." Finally, just before dawn, their son was born. He came into the world squalling and red-faced, healthy and whole, and when the doctor placed him in Margaret's arms, she felt a love so intense it was almost painful. "He is perfect," Russell breathed, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas William Kane, Thomas for Margaret's first husband, William for Russell's father. Margaret wanted to honor the man who had been kind to her, even if his brother had not been, and Russell understood. "Thomas would have wanted you to be happy," Russell said as they gazed at their sleeping son. "He would have wanted you to have a family and a home. This is not a betrayal of him. It is a fulfillment of the dreams you both had." Margaret knew he was right. She would always carry a piece of Thomas in her heart, but her life was with Russell now, and their son was a symbol of new beginnings, not endings. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes. When he was 3, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Emma Rose, after Russell's sister and Margaret's mother. 2 years after that came another son, Henry James, named for the foreman who had become like family to them all. The ranch prospered under Russell and Margaret's joint management. They expanded the horse breeding operation, gained a reputation for quality stock, and became respected members of the community. The gossip about Margaret's hasty remarriage faded, replaced by admiration for how hard she worked and how well she managed her family and the ranch. Franklin Monroe never did reconcile with Margaret, but she made peace with that. She had tried several times over the years to extend an olive branch, but Franklin's bitterness and greed had hardened him beyond reach. Eventually, she stopped trying, focusing instead on her own family and their happiness. Mrs. Garrett remained a constant presence in their lives, graduating from housekeeper to beloved honorary grandmother. She taught the children to cook and sew, told them stories, and spoiled them with treats. When she finally grew too old to make the journey from town, she moved permanently into the ranch house, taking over the spare room that had once been Margaret's. On a warm June evening in 1890, Margaret sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Russell sat beside her, their fingers intertwined, while their children played in the yard. Thomas, now 9 years old, was teaching 6-year-old Emma how to rope a fence post, while 4-year-old Henry toddled after them, determined to keep up with his older siblings. "Do you ever think about that day?" Russell asked quietly. "The day I found you on that bench?" "All the time," Margaret admitted. "I think about how close I came to giving up, to simply accepting that I had no future. And then you appeared. I did not do anything special. I just offered help." "You did everything," Margaret corrected him. "You saw me when I felt invisible. You gave me shelter when I had none. You treated me with dignity when I had been stripped of it. You taught me that I could love again, that I could build a new life from the ashes of the old one." Russell raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You taught me that a house is not a home without someone to share it with. You brought light into my life, Margaret. You and our children are my greatest blessings." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children play. Emma shrieked with laughter as Thomas's rope finally settled around the fence post, and Henry clapped his chubby hands in delight. "I am grateful," Margaret said softly, "for all of it, even the pain, because it led me here, to you, to this life." "No regrets?" "Not a single one." As the sun dipped below the mountains and the stars began to emerge, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. She had lost much in her life, endured hardship and injustice, faced uncertainty and fear, but she had also gained everything that truly mattered. She had love, family, purpose, and a home that no one could take from her, because it was not built on property deeds or legal documents. It was built on commitment and partnership and the daily choice to care for each other. The cowboy who had taken her in without question had become her husband, her partner, her greatest love, and the woman who had been thrown out with nowhere to go had become a mother, a rancher, a vital part of a thriving community. Together, they had built something lasting and true. As darkness fell and Russell called the children inside for supper, Margaret took one last look at the land she had come to love. The ranch sprawled before her, solid and real, a testament to what could be built when people chose kindness over cruelty, hope over despair, love over fear. She rose from her chair and followed her family inside, closing the door on the past and embracing the future that stretched ahead, bright and full of promise. The wild Montana wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of sage and wildflowers, and Margaret smiled. She was home. Finally, completely, utterly home. In the years that followed, the Kane Ranch became a landmark in the Deer Lodge area. People spoke of it as an example of what hard work and determination could achieve. But those who knew the family well understood that its true foundation was something simpler and more profound. It was built on the moment when a cowboy saw someone in need and chose compassion, and when a woman in despair chose to trust again. Thomas, Emma, and Henry grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, though Margaret and Russell edited out the harshest details until the children were old enough to understand. They learned from their parents' example that kindness was not weakness, that offering help to someone in need was always the right choice, and that love could bloom even in the most difficult circumstances. The cameo brooch that had caused so much trouble became a family heirloom, passed down through generations along with the story of its significance. It reminded each generation that sometimes the smallest things hold the greatest value, not in money, but in memory and meaning. Franklin Monroe lost his ranch in 1895, a combination of poor management and bad luck, driving him into bankruptcy. Margaret heard the news without satisfaction or schadenfreude, only sadness that he had never learned the lessons life tried to teach him. She sent money anonymously through the bank to help Constance and the children, though Franklin never knew the source of the unexpected assistance. Russell and Margaret grew old together on the ranch they had built. They saw their children marry and have children of their own, expanding the family and the operation until the Kane Ranch employed dozens of people and was known throughout Montana for the quality of its horses and the integrity of its owners. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Russell surprised Margaret with a gift. It was a leather-bound journal filled with his handwriting. "I have been writing down our story," he explained as she turned the pages with wonder. "I wanted our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know how we found each other, how love can come from the darkest moments, how choosing to help someone can change both your lives." Margaret read through the journal with tears streaming down her face, reliving their journey from that desperate day in September 1881 to this moment of celebration 3 decades later. Russell had captured everything: the fear and uncertainty of those early days, the slow building of trust and affection, the joy of their growing family, the challenges they had faced and overcome together. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." "Thank you," Russell countered, "for saying yes when I offered you that room, for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy who did not even know what he was missing until he found you, for building this life with me." They celebrated their anniversary surrounded by family and friends, the ranch house bursting with laughter and music and love. As Margaret looked around at the life they had created, she remembered the woman she had been 30 years ago, sitting on that bench with nothing but a trunk and $12, believing her life was over. She had been so wrong. Her life had not been ending that day. It had been beginning. Late that night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Margaret and Russell walked hand in hand through the moonlit ranch. Their steps were slower now, their hair silver, but their love had only deepened with time. "If you could go back," Russell asked, "and tell that woman on the bench what was coming, what would you say?" Margaret thought about this carefully. "I would tell her to hold on. That help is coming from an unexpected source, that life will break your heart, but it will also heal it if you let it. That the worst day of your life can lead to the best years if you stay open to possibility." "Wise words," Russell said, pulling her close. "Hard-earned wisdom," Margaret replied, resting her head on his shoulder. They stood there in the Montana night, surrounded by the land they had tamed together, the family they had created, the legacy they would leave behind. The Wild West that had once seemed so harsh and unforgiving had become home. The cowboy who had taken her in without question had become her everything. And the woman who had been thrown out with nothing had discovered that sometimes losing everything makes room for something better to grow. As they walked back to the house, Margaret felt the full weight of her gratitude, not just for Russell, though he was the center of it, but for the entire journey, for the pain that had taught her strength, for the kindness that had taught her to trust again, for the love that had taught her that hearts are more resilient than we ever imagine. The door to their home stood open, light spilling out into the darkness, and Margaret and Russell walked through it together, as they had for 30 years, as they would for whatever years remained to them. Behind them, the Montana night settled over the ranch, peaceful and still, while inside, their family slept safe and loved. It was a good life, a life built on foundations that would last for generations, a life that had started with a single act of compassion and grown into something neither of them could have imagined. A life that proved beyond any doubt that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion or romance, but with one person seeing another's need and simply saying, without question or hesitation, "Come home with me." And Margaret had. She had gone home with Russell Kane that September day in 1881, and in doing so had found her true home at last, not just a place, but a person, not just shelter, but belonging. Not just survival, but a love that would last beyond their lifetimes, living on in the children and grandchildren who carried their story forward into the future. The Wild West, with all its hardships and uncertainties, had given them each other. And that, Margaret thought as she drifted off to sleep in Russell's arms, was the greatest gift of all.